Thank you, Maria, and welcome everybody. It's great to have you all with us, to have taken the time tonight, whichever time zone, day or night it is in. My name is Professor Darryl Higgins. I'm Director of the Institute of Child Protection Studies at Australian Catholic University, and we're very pleased to present this webinar as part of the webinar series hosted by the Global Safeguarding Alliance and supported by Porticus Foundation. So a particular welcome to our Global Safeguarding Alliance partners and to Porticus Foundation as well. The Alliance was formed in 2020 by a group of academic, teaching and research institutions and practice-oriented professional schools and individual experts. And we're pleased that the Institute of Child Protection Studies is one of the inaugural members of the Alliance. It's dedicated to promoting the goal of safeguarding, as well as promoting knowledge and exchanging ideas worldwide on the prevention of abuse of children, adolescents, and other vulnerable persons. In our own work at the Institute of Child Protection Studies here at the Australian Catholic University is closely aligned with the aims of the Alliance. Established in 2005, the Institute is a nationally recognised centre of excellence for research here in Australia in the area of child, youth and family wellbeing. Safety and wellbeing of children and young people is central to our work. Understanding their experiences and providing them opportunities to inform our work helps us create evidence-informed solutions for services, systems, policies, and practices. And we're committed to strengthening the capacity of families, communities, and workforces to prevent child abuse and neglect. Now, I'd like to direct all of your attention to the topic of today's webinar: how adults across the Catholic Church and church-related entities perceive their safeguarding capabilities. This is based on a study that was undertaken by the Global Safeguarding Alliance and led by my colleague, Douglas Russell. Douglas is leading research in two key areas at the Institute of Child Protection Studies. Firstly, the participation of children and young people in child-safe organisational processes, and secondly, the capabilities of staff and volunteers to prevent and respond to organisational child sexual abuse. With a background as a primary school teacher and his studies in psychology, Douglas's key focus has always been on the wellbeing of children, and he's currently pursuing his PhD studies at the University of Melbourne, as well as working with us at the Institute. Today, he's going to be presenting findings from the global study conducted in 7 different countries with collaboration from their GSA members. It involved a range of adults associated with the Catholic Church, including clergy, school teachers, lay people, and those in safeguarding specialist roles in church ministries. And the study revealed notable differences in attitudes, self-confidence, and perceptions of the level of awareness and knowledge about safeguarding. So to hear more about the study, I'm going to hand over to you, Douglas, and I know that you're going to acknowledge country and also survivors, which are really important for us here in Australia. So over to you. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our webinar this morning, afternoon, evening, or on the recording. I'm going to attempt to share my screen, so bear with me because I now apparently have 3 of them as opposed to 2. And I'm hoping you are seeing the main presentation. Yes, I've got some thumbs up there. Fantastic. So thanks so much, Maria, for all of your organization of this evening's webinar. Thank you, Darryl, for the introduction. Thank you to Porticus for the funding that has supported not only the project that I'm presenting, but our work to ensure that research is reaching a broader audience, and an audience that can actually utilize the recommendations that our research and research globally being conducted regarding safeguarding can do. So as Darryl explained, I will be largely talking this evening about a study that focuses on safeguarding capabilities across the Catholic Church in 7 different countries and looking at strengths, areas of focus, and next steps. I will speak about the background, which many of us will know. So by all means, hopefully that will be a quick refresher, but happy to sort of focus on anything that's of interest. But then looking at what we can do as a community. I think it's important to understand that whilst this particular project and this evening's webinar does have a focus specifically on the church, It's very clear in some of the work that I do, and I know that many of my colleagues do from a research perspective, that the findings we often come across are not always specific to a specific context. As I was developing this presentation and going over it, I could see so many similarities to some of the challenges that, for example, the sports sector is facing. So whether you've got friends or colleagues that are associated with the church, another faith, or a non-secular organization, then they may be interested in signing up to the GSA subscription list, as I assume most of you are, or watching the specific webinar. So today's talk, I will do some acknowledgements before we begin, and I will look at the context that forms the background of the work that we conducted in relation to the study, a lot of the work that you yourselves may do, and the research that we conduct at ICPS and as part of the Global Safeguarding Alliance. We'll look at some of the key challenges specifically for the church in relation to safeguarding, and then we'll look at this recent study across the 7 different countries. We'll look at the impact on church members and professionals from the findings that we've identified through our study, and the strategies for improvement and the path forward for us as a community. So, as is customary in Australia, I do want to acknowledge country, and that is, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that I and many of my ICPS colleagues work and live and socialise. And for us in Naarm, down in Melbourne, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that Indigenous, Aboriginal, and Torres Strait Islander people have and still suffer abuse as a result of colonisation. I'd also, and importantly, would like to acknowledge survivors. So I'd like to begin with a moment of reflection to acknowledge the survivors of sexual abuse, specifically within the church, but outside of the church as well. I want to take a moment to recognise and honour those who've been affected by the devastating history of abuse within the church, and remember that survivors and their courage in sharing their stories is important on the road to healing, and that we as a church community must acknowledge the pain that we've caused, offer our support, and strive towards a future where safeguarding is paramount. So this presentation is not just about policies, it's about real people whose lives have been affected or could be affected by abuse. And this sets a compassionate tone, I hope, for the work that we do as an institute, as a community, and within the Alliance. So the child sexual abuse scandal in the church is, to a large part, has been made prominent and has made global awareness as a result of some of the inquiries that have happened over more than 20 years ago now. So starting with the Boston scandal over 20 years ago, looking specifically in the US in Boston, marking a turning point for the issue and bringing global attention to abuse in the church, leading on to the Irish Commission, which looked specifically at Catholic-run schools and orphanages. So again, looking at not only a national reckoning, but also starting to really help the church to understand that this is a potentially a global issue that they're going to start looking at. That was in 2009. And the Australian Royal Commission, which, although it did not have a focus specifically on the church, it had 17 volumes in its report in 2017, and one entire volume of that was associated with the church. These inquiries and the work that's happened since has exposed institutional failings and inadequate responses in relation to abuse that occurred. It did trigger global awareness of church safeguarding failures, and it set a foundation for the church to reform and to make changes to ensure that children and young people and vulnerable adults are safe from abuse. In Australia, we can see ACSL here, and I know we've got some colleagues here from ACSL. Welcome. The Australian Catholic Safeguarding Limited is the body that supports the church here in Australia to improve its practice, to look at policies, and to support the training of people associated, professionals and members of the church, and also conducts audits. So many reforms beginning to happen as a result of these inquiries. What other impact did these inquiries have on the church? Well, safeguarding policies started to get reformed worldwide, and these even went straight, started coming from the Vatican themselves. So doctrines, policies, suggested practices, and discussions centering at the center of the Catholic Church there in the Vatican. Equally, there was a focus on reporting, accountability, and transparency. Now, I think with some organizations, some areas of the church that might have and may still be a focus on historical abuse and making reparations and organizing support for those who have been abused. For some, there might be a focus on prevention of abuse of children and young people today and in the future. And for some, they may be working across both of those streams, which is equally important. So making sure that there's the documentation and that things are done transparently is very important. Safeguarding committees and these sorts of aspects of safeguarding reform have happened as a result. The impact has varied. So these inquiries, for a large part, have created a focus on clergy, in particular religious men and women, and people, and it's either affected people in safeguarding roles or made it very apparent that safeguarding roles need to be within the church, within relevant sections, schools, dioceses, so forth. So that impact is varied, but the other variation or challenge that the church faces is the fact that there are countries that haven't had national inquiries, and the challenges that those countries face in relation to their reforms and their practices in relation to safeguarding are very different to the reforms, practices, and section of the journey that countries that have had those inquiries are sitting on. So we need these reforms. We know that these reforms have reshaped the church's approach to child safeguarding, but their implementation has been different, particularly outside of countries with those high-profile inquiries. So there is a number of global safeguarding frameworks that can help guide the church, as well as other organizations, in their safeguarding work. The UN Convention of the Rights of the Child is obviously one of the main ones from 1989. It sets the legal and moral foundation for safeguarding children globally. It's obviously highly relevant to church policies as it demands that all institutions, including religious ones, protect children's rights. So children's rights is definitely a lens that much of the research that happens in this space is used for. In Australia, many of the states are now implementing child safe standards based off our national principles. And these not only include the rights of children to be protected, but also the rights of children to be involved in decision making. So, very interested to hear from others, either in the chat. Please feel free to get in touch with us about whether you think this is happening in your country or in your context, whether you think it's a challenge, whether you think this is something you're doing really well, and sharing your practices would be great. The World Health Organization guidelines also provide a public health approach to safeguarding. So Professor Daryl Higgins, who introduced me, does some amazing work in this space, looking at how a public health approach is a very positive and effective way to deal with and improve safeguarding issues. And in fact, going back to the children's rights of the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child, Associate Professor Tim Moore, who's our Deputy Director here at ICPS, does some fantastic work in this space as well. More specifically to the Church, the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors is obviously responsible for and plays a role in internal church reforms in relation to safeguarding, as the Vatican does with different texts and things that are put forward. And then global frameworks in general that influence church policies as well, but considering again that those will have regional differences. So, global frameworks, but also laws within each country will very much make it a different journey for all of us in the church. It may be one church, but it's one church in many places. So how do we know, on top of the fact that, victim survivors are coming forward, we know from things like these inquiries that there are issues? What does the research tell us about what the needs of the church are in relation to safeguarding? So myself and Professor Higgins did publish a paper back in 2022. I'm hoping Maria is going to put a link in the chat to this one. We looked specifically at children and young people's perception of safety in religious and faith-based institutes. Much of the research that had been done prior to around 2015 was from adults' perspectives. So again, our Deputy Director, Dr. Tim Moore, did some work funded by the Royal Commission in developing the Australian Safe Kids Young People Survey, which we still use at ICPS in our Children's Safety Survey. This looked not specifically at church, but at any organisation that may interact with children and has a role and responsibility to keep them safe. We looked specifically at church, and we ran focus groups asking young people, what are some of the things that make you feel unsafe when you're at church or Sunday school? Looking very much at the ministry, sort of diocese-based context, so not thinking about schools or housing services or anything like that. There were 4 main things that they came up with. One of them was concerning behavior. If they saw concerning behavior from a person, that might make them feel unsafe. And this might come from people in trusted roles within the church. It could be another young person. It could be an adult. One of them was fear of judgment. So fear of judgment from their peers, but also fear of judgment from adults. Those could be religious figures, but they could just be the laity, other adults who have come along to mass or something like that. But that fear of being judged was something that could potentially make young people feel unsafe when they were at church. Power dynamics, this was really not a surprising one. It's a factor that's seen across every context in relation to abuse. Power dynamics are a risk factor for abuse occurring. And this is very much the potential within the Catholic Church and other faiths and denominations due to religious hierarchies, making it hard for young people to feel like they can speak out or say no. And a sense of familiarity was another interesting one, but this was interesting in the sense that some young people spoke about the sense of familiarity making them feel unsafe because they weren't familiar with people that were at church. But then others said that some people would act in a way that was too familiar, like they pretended that they were very close family with the children when in fact they weren't. And this might make them feel unsafe because they were behaving in the child or young person's mind inappropriately. So, please feel free to have a look at that paper. If you've got questions, please reach out. We will hopefully have some resources from that we can share with you that aren't an academic paper in itself. The Royal Commission also identified how everyone, not just leaders, need to have the skills, knowledge, and confidence to keep children and young people safe. So some evidence there from inquiries and from research, helping us to understand what are some of the things that we need to think about within our day-to-day practice and within the church community to help children and young people feel safe. So there are challenges that we face as a church community. And we've got 4 of these to discuss now. My apologies, my Flickr screen has just disappeared on me. Here we go. So the first of these is the challenge of allocating resources. I don't think that this is a church-specific challenge. It requires time, money, and personnel to create and manage and put into effect safeguarding policies and practices. So being able to identify where those resources are coming from can be a challenge. Another barrier that the church faces is internal pushback or cultural resistance. So, thoughts that this problem is a church problem only in English-speaking countries because we haven't had anyone come forward to say they have been abused, therefore it has not happened, is something that's still potentially, well, it's not potentially being said, it is still being said, is my understanding. Pushback in relation to this is a historical issue, and it's been identified, and that's great, but it's not necessarily something that needs to be a huge focus now. That's another pushback or cultural resistance that again can be a barrier to implementing good safeguarding practice. The barrier of limited engagement and resources for laypersons. So there's been a lot of work over the last few years in Australia, particularly in the last sort of 7 years since the Royal Commission, that's focused on leaders within organizations and workers and professionals within organizations, but bringing in the wider community, and in this case in the church, we would term that the laity or lay persons, is something that hasn't been a focus. Again, I would argue that this is something that other sectors are also are going to be grappling with over the next few years. And then whether or not this is a good icon for it, the challenge of implementing these uniform policies across the diverse church communities. Again, it is one church, but it is many locations and many places. So understanding how we approach that, how do we have something that is uniform, but also bespoke and specialized to the different laws, the different cultural needs, the different human needs within each country. Keeping children safe in Australia looks very different to what keeping children safe in an African country or an Asian country might look like. The needs are different. And so understanding what the focus of safeguarding work should be, as much as we need it to be uniform, it does need to be specific as well. So I'd like to move on and talk about the capabilities projects that Daryl introduced. It is a Global Safeguarding Alliance project. I'm hoping that everyone that's here tonight or watching the recording has signed up to the Global Safeguarding Alliance subscription. We're looking forward to sending out our first newsletter in the coming weeks. Maria, if it's possible, could you put the sign up link in the chat, and we'll make sure that that's there in the YouTube comments for anyone that's watching that's keen to sign up. You'll get information about future webinars, our newsletter, and information about research. So the recruitment for this project came from 7 countries: Australia, Ghana, India, Italy, the Philippines, Poland, and the UK. And the Global Safeguarding Alliance members are located in these countries and helped with this recruitment. It's probably important at this point to stipulate that this project is seen essentially as a pilot project, considering it's across 7 countries. Whilst the sample size is very good, it is a small sample size for that many countries. It's also important that we think about the fact that within this project, what we measured and how we often speak about what's being measured is really important for us to consider as well. So I'll move on to the measurement in a minute, but first I just want to quickly go over the fact that we had 184 participants in total, and you can see the breakdown in this table, firstly across the roles within the church. So we've got clergy and religious men and women, or RMW, students, lay people, school staff, and safeguarding officers. And then we have the countries: the Philippines, the United Kingdom, Ghana, India, Italy, Poland, Australia, and one for whom we did not have the country data. The Italian data, it's important to understand that these people, whilst residing in Italy and filling the survey out while in Italy, actually came from all of these countries here on the left. So their responses may be more indicative of those countries, but for some of them, they were the only person in that country. So we've actually removed Italy from the country analysis. We've only compared the country, 6 countries in our analysis here. excuse me. We had participants aged from 21 to 89, with median age just under 50, and just over half the participants were male, which may or may not be a surprise depending on looking at the sample here. Many of the students in this subsample were seminarians, but some of them were not. Some of them were studying safeguarding work, and degrees and diplomas to support them in their role in the church, whilst not being a clergy. Sorry, I'm just moving my little bar there. Oh, thank you. The only other thing I wanted to point out here is the lack of consistency across the countries and the roles combined. And what I mean by that is we can see that Australia had a fairly small sample. The fact is that sample all came from one group. I'm confident there's no students in that sample, for example. There's likely to be no lay people either. Equally, I know that in Poland, a large proportion of the sample is students, for example. The United Kingdom, I think, has no students, for example, in their sample. So it's important to consider when we talk about the countries that we're not necessarily talking about a specific role, and vice versa. When we talk about a specific role, this may not be indicative of what's happening in a specific country. We did control for this in our analyses, and I'll talk about that more as we move forward. So we used the Safeguarding Capabilities Survey that was developed at ICPS as part of this project. It has 4 domains, and it's really important to understand what these domains are measuring, but also what these domains are not measuring. So there's awareness of policies and procedures and the culture of safeguarding within the organization. There's confidence to act. There's attitudes towards the importance of safeguarding, and there's knowledge of situational prevention and the importance of including children and young people's views. So attitudes are obviously that people are measuring their own attitudes because it is a self-report survey. They're not reporting someone else's attitudes or their attitudes in relation to someone else. They are reporting their own personal attitude. Their knowledge, we don't actually measure actual knowledge. We measure perceived knowledge. So we don't ask people, out of these 5 laws, which one is the correct one, or please tick all of the following things that are risk factors. That would be testing actual knowledge. We test their perception of their knowledge. So we will ask them questions like, I am aware of the risk factors for abuse within my organization. They might feel that they do know that, but we don't know, we haven't tested that. So we would need to be very specific, know what the factors are within their organization, and ask them specifically about that. The reason the survey doesn't do that is because the survey was developed in an effort to be as broadly applicable as possible. So we have sports organizations, we have public and private schools, we have out-of-home care facilities that aren't related to the church filling in the survey. So we can't, and we have it being surveyed internationally. So obviously there's different laws applying. And so that's why it's really important to be aware that we're measuring perception of knowledge, a person's self-perceived awareness of the policies and procedures. We can say, do you know that whether there is a code of conduct in your organization? And they go say, yes, I know there's a code of conduct. We haven't asked them if they know what's in that code of conduct. So there are some limitations in relation to what it's measuring, but it does give a great understanding to organizational leaders who can see the results when they take part in the survey. What are some of the things they might need to focus on? So an example item is my organization makes sure I'm aware of things that our organization can do to protect children and young people from sexual abuse. So we looked at these differences between the roles or between the different countries using what's called a MANOVA, a multiple analysis of variance. So this allows us to look at multiple different outcomes. And in this case, that's these 4 domains here across multiple different groups. So not just 2 groups, but more than 2 groups. The survey is currently being translated into German and Spanish. And if anybody is interested and you don't have to be an academic. But if anyone thinks that they would like to be involved in translating the survey and are extremely fluent in their native language or a language and English, there is a process that we would go through to do that. Please do get in touch via one of the contact channels that we share. So moving on to the results. So here we can see the overall scores for the 4 domains: attitudes, awareness, confidence, and knowledge. 4.07, 3.86, 3.96, and 4.27. Those are mean scores between a scale of 1 to 5. So you can see that they're quite highly skewed towards the upper end, which is a positive thing, but we don't have a baseline of what this was like, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, because the survey's only just been developed. So we don't know if that's any different to what it would have been prior to a lot of the work that many of us are doing. So I've highlighted here in green and red the groups that scored the highest or the lowest in these 4 areas. So clergy and religious men and women scored highest in relation to their attitudes towards safeguarding and their awareness of policies and procedures. The confidence and knowledge, however, was most high in students and seminarians. The group that scored the lowest across all 4 areas were lay people, or the laity. Now, it's important to keep in mind that none of the Global Safeguarding Alliance members sort of asked general churchgoers, parishioners, for example, to fill in the survey. These are still people that likely have a role of some sort in the church. It might be volunteer. It's purely that they did not fit into one of these other categories. So that's a really important thing to consider when looking at these results. So we can see that confidence, students have the highest confidence and knowledge. This is potentially not a surprise. They are currently learning in an environment and in an age where safeguarding is being spoken about. So this is great. And I know, having attended conferences that are church safeguarding specific, that the idea of ongoing formation is something that's being discussed. So training for others, which I think sort of would match this activity that the students are potentially going through, and that's supporting their confidence and knowledge. And this would obviously be great, for example, for clergy and for other people who haven't scored as high as them. Equally, it's very positive and not necessarily surprising to see that clergy and religious men and women have scored highest in attitudes and awareness. Whilst this is not a representative sample of what's happening either in these countries or across the church globally, there are definitely going to be clergy and religious men and women whose attitudes are not where we would like them at this point. But the sample that we had in this small pilot project was that they had positive attitudes and that they are aware of policies and procedures. And that's a good sign, because we're hoping that they've been involved in developing those, are on safeguarding committees where these are, edited and developed and spoken about. We've also got results by country. So again, we've got the same overall scores here from the same participants, and you can see that across the board, there's some varying results in regards to which countries scored high and which countries did not score as well as others. So I think one of the interesting results here was Australia. It's a really small subsample, but they did have the highest attitudes and awareness in relation to safeguarding. But interestingly, they had the lowest confidence. And I'll speak about that in a minute. Ghana, alternatively, does not have high attitudes and awareness. Not the lowest, but not high, but has very high confidence. So again, thinking about whether that confidence is backed up by a good awareness and good knowledge. And we can see here that they were one of the lowest scoring in knowledge in relation to sort of how to prevent abuse. What does situational prevention look like? How should I be involving children and young people in these decisions? And if they haven't got the knowledge or the awareness of how to do that, then they might have a sort of false confidence in relation to what's happening. Again, keeping in mind, very small sample here. It may have been very skewed towards safeguarding officers or people working in Catholic schools, where teachers often are seen as hierarchical figures in the school setting. The Philippines scoring fairly low on awareness, but the UK scoring fairly high in knowledge. So what can we conclude from our findings in our study? So we know that seminarians and students appear to have the most confidence and highest knowledge. As I said, I think that tells us that if we want to improve people's knowledge and confidence in how to prevent and respond appropriately to abuse, we need learning opportunities. There needs to be some ongoing education, and that's going to look different for different people in different roles within the church. And that education is probably going to look different in each country, depending on where in the safeguarding journey and what's important to children and young people is actually the case. Clergy and religious men and women have the most positive self-perceived attitudes towards safeguarding and awareness of policies. Again, with our small sample, we need to identify how we can get this positive attitude into dioceses, into countries, into contexts and areas where we might be seeing some of that institutional pushback or that kind of protection of the reputation of the church. Country-wise, Australia has those positive attitudes and good awareness, but is that actually causing lower confidence? Is it that we're feeding our Australian colleagues all of this information? This is how you keep children safe. This is how important safeguarding is. And as these people absorb this information, they suddenly think, how do I do all of this? No, I don't think I can do that actually. And so we need to work out, are we inadvertently hampering safeguarding attitudes by this increased awareness without actually giving them that confidence? So again, I'll talk soon about how that might impact what our education looks like moving forward. Knowledge is highest in the UK and lowest in Ghana and India. So again, thinking about how the UK and other English-speaking countries have had some of these inquiries, is there something we can do as a church? It may not be a national inquiry, but is there some form of church inquiry that could happen in countries where we need to try and understand what is the safeguarding issue, what is the sexual abuse issue currently and historically in some of these other countries that I know that there are people doing great work trying to improve safeguarding practice. So I want to focus a little bit specifically on the clergy and the laity because of some of these findings that we've had. So there are some crossovers, there are some unique aspects to the impact that our study has on what we need to do moving forward. So there is a high responsibility placed on clergy in relation to safeguarding, and rightfully so. They are seen as leaders of the church, and they need to lead us in making sure that we are able to keep children and young people safe. There's been a strong focus on training for clergy and for people working within the church. But one of these challenges that they face is the institutional pressures that might hinder policy implementation. On the flip side, laity, they have a role to play that's integral, but it's often less formally recognized in relation to how, as a wider community, we can keep safeguarding children, young people, and vulnerable adults. They generally have less formal training, so their knowledge may vary. So, it's potentially not a surprise that clergy are scoring high in awareness when they're the ones that are being informed of what the new policies and procedures and the importance of safeguarding are. One of the challenges is that the laity may feel unsupported or less empowered to act as a result of some of those barriers and challenges we looked at earlier. But what do we know that is the same for both of these? Both the clergy and the laity have a commitment to safeguarding, and they both need support in making sure that they can play the role that they need to play in safeguarding children, young people, and vulnerable adults. So what are the implications for safeguarding training moving forward? Having thought about this context that we've been shifting through over the last sort of 20 years, and this study that was helping us to understand the capabilities within the church globally. There's definitely increased awareness of safeguarding, but it may be lowering confidence. We really need more investigation of this. So we're really excited at ICPS and the Global Safeguarding Alliance to think about how we might understand how this increased awareness and education and training, what is it supporting the development of, and is it actually having any negative effects? What are those? How can we counter those and stop those from happening? We also know that countries with government inquiries have people in the church with better attitudes and awareness and perceptions of knowledge of safeguarding. So how do we then balance the uniform approach or our approach within different countries? I know again from some of the conversations I've had with my global colleagues, we are at very different stages of our journey in safeguarding across the different contexts that we live and work in. So thinking about how we can work together to support each other is something that we're hoping our Global Safeguarding Alliance subscriber list will be able to support everyone with. So strategies for improvement in safeguarding, we need to think about standardized but also specific training programs for all church members. So standardized maybe within a country, but specific across different countries because of the different needs they have. We need safe reporting channels for transparency. This includes for historical cases as well as contemporary issues and concerns of safety. We need ongoing support for an inclusion of the laity in making this a whole of community response to safeguarding, and also building a safeguarding culture across the church. So what might this look like? So I spoke earlier about building confidence through education or formation. Excuse me. So we'd start at the bottom step. We need to start at initial education. Do people have the knowledge they need in order to understand the importance of safeguarding? What are some of the risk and protective factors that play a role? And how is it that safeguarding is implemented within their country? Is there a public health approach where primary prevention is occurring, or is it more of a secondary, or even are we stuck in this tertiary response? Once abuse occurs, that's when we'll step in. Once we've got that initial education, we can get some growing understanding, looking at awareness. We then need to move that forward into practical experience. We need to borrow from some of the learning theories and make sure that there's some action happening and that there's practice of this knowledge and awareness. Now, that can be really difficult to do because obviously practical experience might sound like, well, we need to have abuse occurring. We're not going to do that so that that practical experience happens, but there might be opportunities for hypothetical situations for someone coming in and making a disclosure of, a safety concern or abuse, and putting all of that learning into practice, and putting those reporting and accountability processes, documentations into practice, and checking, is everything being done? Does everyone know what they're doing? And then leading it on to long-term education. So we can't just do something and tick a box and say, yes, we've taught that, they did that in their induction, and their illustrious career of 15 years in our organization will be fine. We need that ongoing long-term education to develop that confidence. And as we could see, that confidence is definitely one of the important ones. So I'm nearly finished speaking. I'm hoping there's some questions in the chat. I know Daryl's going to have a look at those for me and pose those to me once we're done in a couple of slides. So what are our next steps at the Global Safeguarding Alliance and ICPS? Well, we're definitely interested in collecting more data. Now, we're definitely interested in collecting data in a much bigger project. We've run this smaller pilot project. We know what it looks like. We know that we need more consistent groups within each country. We know we need more countries. We'd love to see a much bigger project envisioned. So if you're interested in measuring capabilities in your country, if you think you've got the contacts to help us collect from some of those groups like clergy, students and seminarians, the laity in one way or another, and also safeguarding officers and school staff, Catholic school staff, please do email icps@acu.edu.au to let us know. Um, uh, the other thing is, not part of that bigger project. If there are funds available, you can deploy the Safeguarding Capability Survey within the church, within your country. It is in English, as I said. We're getting translations in Spanish and German at the moment. If you get a very large sample size, we can do a translation and test that as well. So again, please do contact us if that's something that interests you. I think from a resource perspective, we need to start sharing existing strategies. So the GSA is working hard to share the research and some resources that are developed from these research projects. I think we need to think about how we as a church and where we can share resources, training manuals, templates. There are some countries and some areas that are further along the safeguarding journey. I know that Australia often gets talked about as a leader, as a country in safeguarding, not just within the church, but in general. We do have a load of experience that we could share. And equally, we want to hear from our colleagues in other countries who are doing amazing things, which are really relevant to some of the sectors we work in, like our church-run out-of-home care facilities. Could probably learn a lot from other countries that deal with larger numbers of children that face the sorts of issues that they face. Developing new strategies to improve areas that are in need. So thinking about how we might develop those strategies and evaluating them as well. We want to increase our membership. Please share the link to subscribing to the GSA newsletter with your colleagues, with your friends who might be interested in safeguarding. Whilst we look at the church context quite a lot, I know that our previous webinar, Gabby's, was not church specific, so it can be people within any organization type. As I said, we're really excited about sharing our upcoming newsletter with you. Here's a link of some links to the articles that I spoke about today. We will send the slides out and make them accessible as a PDF where the links are clickable in the YouTube link and in the mail out after the webinar as well. So please don't feel like you need to copy any of those down or get to them soon. Here's my personal email address and contact number. Please, if you want to get in touch, please do feel free to email me. I'm really excited about the work that I'm leading in relation to developing resources and materials that can help shift research from being about publishing a paper to actually being a resource that can support people who are doing the groundwork. My interest in doing research is not to get publications done as much as that's something I do. I used to be a school teacher, as Daryl said, and knowing that I'm making a difference in the day-to-day lives of children and young people is what drives me. So please do get in touch if there's some sort of resource that you think we could develop, some kind of practice tool, please let us know. The QR code will take you to the academic publication. We will be working on sort of a shorter summary and an infographic summary of that, which will be much more enjoyable to digest than an academic paper often is. I know you're all very busy. That is me. So thank you so much. I couldn't see my timer. We have
You're perfectly on time. Yep, we've got just on 10 minutes left for questions. So thank you, Douglas, for that really engaging and detailed explanation of the background to the study, what we actually conducted, and some really interesting implications. I can see some comments starting to come in. Anne, can we perhaps go to your question first? Would you like to ask it, or I'm happy to read it out if you'd like?
Mute. If you can read it out, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. So Douglas is congratulating you on some fabulous research, but is questioning whether some of the results may actually speak to the broader sector. So could they be applied to contexts outside of the church? You may be able to speak to some of the survey work using the same survey that we've done in a range of other youth serving contexts outside of the church.
Yes, it's a great question, Anne. So we have conducted the Safeguarding Capabilities Survey across numerous different organizations, and there are definitely some similarities in the findings that we have. One of the clear findings we have is that confidence is always the lowest scoring domain out of the four. Keeping in mind, outside of this project, all of the data we've collected is within Australia. Confidence is always the lowest scoring in Australia. It's definitely an issue. Attitudes generally scores extremely high. So most people working with children and young people we know understand and believe it's important to keep them safe, which is great news. They do not necessarily have the confidence to enact all of the policies and procedures that they've been made aware of. Another clear finding that we get that's to me is a concerning one is 1 in 5 staff believe that a working with children check is sufficient to keep children safe and that we don't need to do anything else. And to me, 1 in 5 is way too many. That's far too many. It should be much, much lower than that. I think it's really clear from some of the cases we've seen in Australia in the last couple of years, particularly in the early childhood sector, cases in Queensland and Sydney, where they had their blue card. They had that working with children check, and it did not matter. That abuse was still occurring. So we've got a report from 2018 to 2020 of the overarching Children and Young People Safety Project, which includes the Safeguarding Capabilities Survey. And we are looking before the end of this year to publish another report with data more recent as well. So that's definitely probably going to be of interest. We'll make sure when that gets published that it goes sort of into the newsletter, because I think it might be of interest to subscribers. So thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Douglas. And I can see Jane Leake from Porticus has got a question. But firstly, a big thank you to Porticus for your support for our work. Douglas, Jane's asking, could you reflect a little bit more on that difference between confidence and knowledge, which I think flows nicely from the comments you were just making?
Excuse me. Yeah, definitely. So the 4 domains, we developed a suite of around 140 questions originally, and our wonderful statistical package basically said 73 of these are your key questions. What's interesting, and I didn't highlight, but is potentially of interest, is that the 4 domains have very different numbers of questions or items associated with them. So the awareness domain has 32 items. Confidence has 17, attitudes has 15, and knowledge only has 9. So I think that's really interesting in the scope of the fact that, as I was saying earlier, we don't actually ask them knowledge. We ask them their perception of knowledge, of their knowledge. And that's very different. Asking someone, do you know the risk factors of abuse is very different from actually having a list of 20 things and saying, tick the ones that are factors of abuse. And admittedly, it's a difficult question to ask, because if, for example, you look up what is the age-based risk factor for abuse, the way different researchers have investigated it, the different contexts it's in, I mean, we can come up with a general idea, but again, country differences can make that very different. The confidence one is very much about a person's perceived confidence in acting when they need to. One of the example questions is, if I saw one of my colleagues acting in a way that was not in line with the code of conduct, I would feel confident speaking to them about that. And again, that scores very poorly across the board. Going back to Anne's question, a lot of people struggle with feeling like they could pull up someone who is a colleague, potentially a friend, in relation to that. So I think, but as much as using the existing Safeguarding Capability Survey, including its translations, to do a bigger project would be great, maybe we really need to even dive deeper and kind of go, well, what are some of the basic facts and knowledge that we could ask people that transcend borders and context? Are there some? you know, or do we need to come up with a new questionnaire that has that, is a really important consideration, because it almost to an extent goes to this issue that's becoming highlighted within the research community, which is that we know that, for example, protective behaviors programs teach kids knowledge and awareness of how to stay safe. But we do not really have much research evidence, if any, that actually gives us evidence that it keeps them safe. Because linking a group of children, a large group of children that have gone through those programs with a large group that haven't, and to see 20 years later which ones suffered abuse and which ones didn't, it hasn't happened yet. And again, you know, I can just see instantly someone going, well, it wasn't a randomized control trial, so it's not gold standard, is it? So, you know, we would have to see how we can go about something like that, and it would be a long game. But I know ICPS would be up for the challenge, so let's see how we can get on board for something like that, shall we? I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does,
Thank you.
really, thank you. And I'm just, it makes me wonder if knowledge, high knowledge but low confidence equals a higher number of bystanders. So, but I mean, we didn't have this analysis until we just had this analysis. So thank you. It's just leading to more and more questions, but I think it's getting at the sort of heart of what do we need to know and believe to have the confidence to act and have the confidence to act safely. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I think it's a really interesting question to consider. Is it better to have higher knowledge but confidence that doesn't quite match with that, or the other way round, you know, to have high confidence but have it not matched by sufficient knowledge? And I think we can all think of where the bigger risk might lie there. Now we have 1 or 2 more minutes. In fact, probably just 1 minute. If there's a very quick question from anybody else on the screen who hasn't yet popped any questions in the chat, we do have a moment. Feel free to either raise a hand or just come off mute and ask your question. No, well, I think that's a testament, Douglas, to what an amazing job you've done of giving us some really rich detail on such an important topic. And I think that from the questions today, we also understand that this is not a unique issue for church-related entities. It's actually a global issue for all youth-serving organisations. And we know, of course, that church and church entity is a really important part of services for children and youth in so many different countries. So thank you again for leading this analysis with the Global Safeguarding Alliance, and in particular for presenting today. So I'm going to now sign off on behalf of the Institute of Child Protection Studies and all of the Global Safeguarding Alliance members. Thank you for attending. And for those who are logging on and listening to this recording, thank you for tuning in. And please continue in your efforts to keep children safe and make church and church entities an organisation that we can be proud of that values children's safety. So thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
They're still there. Douglas, hi, you still there? I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I am. Daryl's calling me on Teams. Do you want to join us on Teams?
Okay, I'll join you there.
Okay.
I'll leave.